Welcome again. I'm just going to summarize. Thanks, President Jones, Mrs. Townsend, for your introduction. I really appreciate it. I am really privileged to be here today. I enjoyed the prayers that you gave. It was a pleasure hearing it. It took me back to Jamaica as a child. At one stage in my life, let me say that I believe I would have been a preacher. Yes, a preacher indeed. I believe that I have some talents, but the bottom line is the talents did not exceed to the part where I was convicted that was my calling. Consequently, I decided that I would not go forward there. So eventually what happened is that in 1988 when Hurricane Gilbert struck, I decided that I would somewhat go to teachers college. Prior to that, I had written to all the colleges rather in Jamaica, including the St. Joseph Teachers College. Can you imagine? In 1988, I was writing to that college only to be told, as a matter of fact, when I got the letter, I was so excited. At least one responded to me. But the response they gave me was, I'm sorry, we do not accept males in our institution. How inclusive was that back then, right? So I went to Bethlehem Teachers College, and while at Bethlehem to do my interview, I fell in love. You know what I fell in love with? I fell in love with the soccer field, the football field, and that's how I started my journey. The love of sports brought me to that place. But as I go through today, I want to look at a few things here. I want us to examine a few things. The concept of diversity, inclusion, and equity. I want us to examine various cases to highlight the need for inclusive practices within our organization and in our classroom. And I'm going to touch on, and I say touch on, the need to establish elements for inclusive school culture, because you can say, all right, this is my view. We can try to have inclusive practices in the classroom, but if as teachers we are working in an organization that doesn't demonstrate the concept of inclusivity, how are we going to implement it in our classroom? And then I want to provide some strategies for enhancing inclusion. All right, so that is going to be where I'm coming from. But before I move on, I think it's utmost important that I explain to you my concept of inclusion, diversity, and of course equity. For me, when I talk about inclusion, I want us to look within a framework. So let us look at a situation. Let us look at a political party or organization. They decided to hold a party after everyone in their constituency has been vaccinated. Even the man that was on the beach the other making noise and behaving badly, then he was arrested. He was also invited to the party. So everyone being invited to the party, that's diversity, right? So we have diversity. Regardless of your political affiliation, you've been invited to the party. However, as you go to that party now, you have different members from each political party there at the nice party, you call it dance in Jamaica, right? And then all of a sudden, a politician from an opposing party says to another opposing supporter, let's have a dance. That's inclusion, right? Now they're dancing together. They're showing that they appreciate each other, right? We have inclusion. We need equity, right? So the music that is playing right now is somewhat troubling. It's like someone pulled a tune and that tune is not aligned with the next political party, and the politician sees that it's offending the opposing supporter. So what the politician does, he stops the sound selector and he says, haul and pull up, as Jamaican terms would say, right? And then he says, all right, I know you feel a bit troubled. What sort of music would you like to play? So now equity is now the person selecting that music. All right? Equity is about individuals being supported to enjoy and have a sense of belonging. And that goes across into your classroom. So I hope that one day in Jamaica we will have a situation where politicians will have free movement across the aisle, and in our classroom that will be demonstrated. But I wanted to contextualize that definition for us to understand the concept of inclusion, diversity, of course, and equity. Education is a fundamental right. Without education, we're going to have disruption in our system. The right of education is paramount for human sustainability. And you know they say that about literacy too, because you know to be literate means you have access to services. You know, if you're computer literate, it means you have access to that website in Florida or wherever that they set up. And by the time they were setting up, everyone with computer literate skills had already booked the sessions, and those with none were left wanting to have their COVID vaccine. So the same thing with inclusion. It opens doors for everyone. Therefore, policymakers and others must contextualize education within a system that is inclusive, not just focusing on those students with special needs. For far too long, we have had a system where individuals and government policies have been surrounding themselves just with individuals with special needs. And my issue is, if you can identify those individuals, what about the others who might be excluded? And when we talk about special needs, it's like someone who has a difficulty or disability that is seen. So in summary, according to UNICEF, education is a powerful tool that can emancipate individuals socially and economically. And as I go forward, I want to go into another aspect too. Because when we talk about inclusion, I'm really talking about access to the curriculum. And I'm talking about access for all. And I'm considering also the diversity of the learner, which also includes the learner's social and cultural background. We have to be proactive in identifying the barriers that can reduce individuals from accessing the curriculum. And you know your teachers, you know them. And we have to reflect on the policies that are designed to marginalize and exclude individuals that are underachieving. And as we go through, I want you to contextualize this. When you think about uptown or the affluent areas, we know they have access and their parents will be supporting them. But when a child is born in poverty and comes into your classroom, we at times do not take the time to include these individuals within the cultural context too. And I want us to look at the reality, because I think when we look at inclusion, and I'm going to pause to ask a question, and I want others to join in. It's just going to be a question. You can just type yes or no, I'll get a feedback. My question to the group today, because I want your active participation. Do you think we can have 100% inclusivity in our system? So I'm going to say that in my lifetime and your lifetime, we'll never reach there. You know, it's like a dream. I have a dream when all things will become equal, and that's all. It's a dream. It will continue to be a dream. But should I say to myself, because it's a dream, I'm not going to work towards making that movement towards inclusivity? Because today we must accept that no country has been successful in constructing the ideal inclusive system. Hence, this is a key point. Inclusion is a work in practice. To be honest, I've gone through a lot of stages. You know the Jamaican system, how we have certain ideologies and how we are against certain things and how we do taboo certain things and so forth. Because if we're truly to build an inclusive society, we have to eradicate our ideologies and assumptions that will limit the inclusion of others. I see when there's an issue with a guy deciding to wear his hair long to enter the classroom, and there's a big write-up about it, and lawyers have to come in place. How did the hair stop and create a barrier for someone wanting to be included? All right, so at this point, I want us to consider that. So if we look at diversity and inclusion, we have a way to go, right? Too often the term diversity and inclusion are suggested as to be synonyms. And I don't like that because, you know, we are a population that in Jamaica we need to be diversified and be inclusive. I'm coming through the airport, about to give a conference at the UWI on something, and 2008. And I go up to this man and he takes my passport. He's unable to pronounce my name and he says to me in the context, "What kind of Al-Qaeda name is this?" And I'm like, "You didn't really say that, did you?" And I reprimanded him. I said, "Listen, that's the name that I have. It's very unique." But unknown to this immigration officer, what he said was not correct. He just used language that alienated me, offended me, and as a matter of fact, if he weren't somewhere else, he would have been fired. After years of working towards diversity, and it has kept things in place. It has kept things in place for those in Jamaica who are not open to certain things. And, you know, there's always a need to recognize women and give them equal opportunity within the classroom and wherever. But for years, diversity, yes, they have more teachers who are women, but they have not placed them on the structure of management in many institutions and organizations. So within the context, diversity in itself will not lead to inclusion. If you have a class that is diversified and they're coming from all areas of Jamaica, for example, they are the affluent individuals, they are individuals from the low socioeconomic class, and they come into your class and you decide that you're going to spend more time on those who are gifted and from the higher level in your society based on their income and social status, then that's not inclusion. You have a diverse class, but you're not inclusive. And as a matter of fact, in Jamaica, we call that curry favor, right? We call that curry favor. The biggest obstacle for inclusion is, and I'd like to touch on this, is really being judgmental. And why do I say this? I'm pulling from my experience, and I want to highlight that teachers need to understand that there are external barriers that come into the classroom space that limit students' engagement and create barriers for them. And because of our assumptions and judgments, we do not support the children. This brings me to a case I came across years ago. I'm not going to label this person, but I want to put a name, and they called him Lippy back in Jamaica. I don't know why, but based on his feature, they might have decided that was his name. I didn't call him that way. But he lived in Gully in Montego Bay. And if you know Montego Bay section, and they call the Gully, it's an area that is very poverty stricken. He came to school without pencils. He came to school without books. He came to school without anything at all. He just came to school and he didn't wear a sock. So he just had his shoes on. And sometimes you notice that he was growing out of the clothes, but he still wore it. Although, they say in Jamaica terms, they say he was expecting flood, but he came. Because what I gave you was information, and based on the information I gave you, within milliseconds you made a judgment, and that's what the research says. However, I want you to know about this person. His behavior was bad, and I'm creating that image now. I did not teach Lippy, but one day I approached him, and I asked him if he could do one thing for me, and he said yes. He said he would go through the day without writing anything on his report. After the morning shift ended, he was excited. He came up to me with his report card, showed me. And I saw the joy in Lippy's face because someone reached out to him. And as a matter of fact, I would play football with the guys there. And I taught at the Montego Bay Secondary School, which was deemed as one of the most difficult schools in Western Jamaica. And I saw the joy. But this case highlights that sometimes our own expectations can limit the support that we give to students with special needs. Lippy had a special need, of course. He needed counseling, mentoring, and so forth. Not because it wasn't physical. He had a behavioral issue too. Lippy case highlights the need for teachers to understand their students' profile. And I know in Jamaica you're big on student profile and make every effort to motivate that student. It's difficult, especially now in COVID. It takes a lot. A few years ago, I returned to Jamaica. I asked about Lippy. He was deceased. There was no one to advocate for Lippy. He just went through the school system, and when he was out, he was out. Collectively, could the teachers of that school have done more? I think yes. But I don't stop here, because Lippy's story is important in understanding that there are strategies for supporting individuals. We need to empower and motivate, because that's a part of the inclusion process. We need to have regular check-ins with our students to know where they're functioning, especially during COVID. You can have informal mentorship that I displayed, although I wasn't teaching him. And of course, Lippy's situation requires a team approach. They needed social workers, guidance counselors, support staff, and a family structure, because in education today, we realize for our children to move out of poverty and to be included in the school system, it needs a comprehensive approach where guidance counselors can become more instrumental in giving you teachers the framework to work effectively with students. And I want to touch on this because this is another important part within the Lippy story. As teachers, and we are going around, we need to foster high expectations for every student setting, because when we foster that, we are doing that within a persona of support. We're building confidence. We let students know that you believe in them and you speak positively about them. Give them the opportunity to participate, because a fundamental principle of inclusion is active voice. Give feedback. Have a high level of support for your students. I strongly believe, and I'm taking this coin from United States, that if you have a no child left behind policy approach in your class, where you say every child is going to be supported, That's the art of supporting individual needs, because that's essential. So have a no child left behind. So when you see everyone putting up their hand and so forth, and you see that child in the back of the class or wherever around the school compound not participating, that child might need access. You never know what these children are going through. And sometimes it's difficult based on the context of Jamaica, because I had a situation once where I was advocating for this child, and I said to the mom, who broke the child's hand? And she said, sir, it was broken by the father. And I'm saying, how can you be telling me this? Did you report it to the police? She made sure to tell me that she had to jump through the window when the incident happened, and there was no police report. Fast forward, I do follow my stories because I want to know about my students that I've engaged with. Roughly 10 years ago, I heard he died in a shootout with the police. He was not a bad student. He was a good boy. He sat in the front of the class. I reached out to him at every point I could. But I could not do the social work part because the system would not support me. And by the way, his father was a bad man. I didn't want to die too young, right? So, I mean, these are contexts that we have to work in. Of course, his father meant the end, but you could see the hardness in the guy's eyes. And what do I mean by to be equity-minded? When I talk about being equity-minded, I'm really talking about the willingness to look at students' outcomes and disparities within their community. So you know that children from this community, a high rate of failure in your school system and classroom, you provide the assistance necessary. We don't leave that student behind, because if we're truly practicing inclusive practices in our class, we will be proactive. And we recognize that it's not because of them why they're in that fashion or state. It's a system. And I want to also put within the case of my advocacy work here, our system in education in Jamaica, United States, and England globally was not created for inclusion. I want you to critically reflect on that point. Because today when we talk about inclusive practices, we realize that schools have to reduce some of these barriers. Now, these barriers are sometimes physical. I want you to respect their aspirations and their struggles too, and always operate in a fairness paradigm. We always have biases. We have to reduce these biases towards children and everyone, and also move beyond those biases to ensure that these do not limit our interactions. Now, the story of Peter and Mary. I use this case to highlight some critical points. And this is just general. We all have these students, right? For example, you have the student that is careless, makes a lot of mistakes, has difficulty paying attention to tasks. We all have these students. If you do have them, if you don't, you can type in the box, I don't. They seem not to listen when spoken directly to. They have difficulty organizing their activities. Do we all have students like that? Could I see some hands up at this point in time? Give me some feedback. We all have students like that, right? Okay, I see some hands being put up at this point. Yes.
There are several.
There are several, thanks for that. In England and United States, these attributes that I've just given you are characteristics of students with attention deficit hyperactive disorder. They are right across the board, and I could go on and on. My wife thinks I'm hyperactive based on my behavior sometimes, but I know I'm not. It's just how I am. But in United States, you know what they do? They tend to give medication on these. And if it's not a medical model, then you have a problem. There are two models of children or situation of disability. One is the medical model. So I'm going to treat you. I'm going to give you all the medication. So when that child comes to the class, he's practically doesn't know what's happening. He's like on the medication. And then there is a social model. We as teachers can address the social model of disability or special needs in our class. And what it talks about is planning, removing the barriers. For example, I taught children with autism for several years. And I had a guy who loved to tap on windows and just look at the cars passing. No, I couldn't involve the child in anything if he was sitting there. So I would remove the child to a place that he has less distraction. All right? So I want us to think about that. So my thing is, we can do that. So if you know you're having problems with certain students, you're going to arrange your seating plan accordingly. You know what? You ever heard this one? Boy, sit at the back, you behave too badly, and you put that child at the back. So guess what? You can't see what the child is going on, and guess what? That's a barrier to the child's learning. And if you're a Bethlehemite, I must confess I had one teacher, Mrs. Hendricks, wonderful teacher from Bethlehem, who put my friend and I for 3 years to sit in front of her. We weren't bad at all, but she decided the two boys from the 26 students would sit exactly in front of her for 3 years, and we couldn't miss a session. So you know what I'm saying? She had her attention on us. Not that we wanted it, but she had it there. And what I'm saying is we can put our seating plan that associate the neediest students in front of us. Provide clear instructions step by step. You know what I'm saying? Step by step instructions at all times for clarity. Check for clarity. It's important. Remove possible barriers away that will cause distractions. And when necessary, model practices that you're going to show them. So it's a step by step, because you know what? You're at step 3 and the person has not even started giving attention to step 1. So guess what? You're going to have to start from step 1. So you need to check for understanding. I have always said to my teachers that are teaching my daughter, how did you know? Did you check for understanding? Did you ask questions for clarity? Differentiated practice does not only sit on a piece of worksheet or an extra task. It sits on the instructions that you will verbally give. So you can see and establish if that student is following, or differentiate your questions to ensure understanding is there. Alright, so I want to touch on another one, Delano's case. And Delano's case is another situation, because we often make the assumption that students are only disabled if you're physically seeing it. And in this case, he was physically disabled to an extent. But we should never assume that all students will have access. Delano, in this situation, I met him in England, not his real name. And as a matter of fact, he was going through process. He was going to be blind after a period of time. Based on that, we had to go through a series of workshops that we had to learn how to support him. His special needs coordinator came and he told us about the situation. As a result, we had to give support. In that support that we gave, we had to present his work in a specific size for him to have access. And when we interacted with him, we had to ensure that he followed the instructions eventually. Now, when we look forward in looking at these things, we have to be aware to consider what is necessary for the support. And I want to give you some ideas at this point. My screen hasn't frozen. So therefore, it goes back, seating plan to ensure access, visual access, and mobility. You will have students with mobility issues, and you have to place them in the class that in case of an emergency they can exit, and so forth. You know, I have a great concern as it relates to supporting students with special needs in the Caribbean at this point. Too often, I find that students are not given the option to be tested. I was on the Matabray River the other day, 2 years ago to be exact, enjoying my ride down when we got a conversation regarding support, and he told me about his son. The bottom line, he did not have any way to access the support or advocate for the support, and I knew the child was having a problem. If we are having these children in our classes, we need to advocate and also differentiate our instructions. And remember, the key thing is also building partnerships with parents. And this is really my final case because I want to go through, but this one is supporting children and building inclusivity in our practice. If you're going to talk about inclusivity, you have to consider building trust with both parents and children. And this case happened in England. I came across Daniel, and I know wherever I find a Daniel, it's always something is interesting. He was not the most well-behaved child, right? However, if you spoke to him in love, he would respond to you. The school that I taught back in UK had many Jamaicans. One particular teacher taught Daniel science. Just imagine working in a science class where the students think that there's no need to follow safety instructions. And I would say that teacher was good. He was a good person. One particular session at lunchtime, it was near lunchtime as a matter of fact, the children in the science class decided, you know what, we're going to have some fun with this Jamaican teacher. He's new, we want to put him through the ropes. They started to throw papers, pens, and everything at him. Very disrespectful. You know, and the teacher got very upset, and you know what? He decided to single out Daniel. and he took Daniel to the side of the class and whispered something in his ear. Daniel told me what, and the teacher told me what, and I think they all said the same thing. The next day, Daniel came to me and he told me about the incident. And being wanting to protect my Jamaican teachers, Jamaicans are. I said, Daniel, he could not have said that. And Daniel looked at me and he said, you're all like him. You're all the same. I lost Daniel's trust. The next day, Daniel took revenge. As my dear teacher friend sat eating his lunch, not box food, Daniel lit a firecracker and threw it into the classroom. Now, this teacher is from Kingston. The impact sent my dear teacher flying to his left, believing that he was under attack, literally under attack, and chairs tumbling all over. He thought he actually was in a shootout. That must have been traumatizing for him. All the white teachers started to say, did you hear what happened? I said, what happened? They said, we need to support this individual. We ran down and we saw the dear male teacher crying. The lack of trust and the lack of respect had caused this situation. I'm using this to say you cannot build inclusivity and inclusive practice if your students do not have any trust. If you say any and everything to students, you're going to have problems, because what these students are so good at now is to make you feel so upset that you say things, and unknowing to you is that they have their camera pulled out from strategic locations in the classroom. So I have created a strategy: fairness and equity for all students. Show respect at all times. Remember, every action you take can be recorded. Always remember that. You never know. And also ensure that your students and parents are partners in the education framework as you move towards an inclusive education for the children in your class. I have some points here as it relates to designing your content online. It touches on universal design. I'm going to share the slides with you at some point. And it talks about engagement, representation. You have to think about the content you're engaging with and how to give consideration to individuals from various levels rather. Here's another chart that I have. When you're doing things online, you have to think about tables, hyperlinks, your recordings, inclusive fonts, visual exams, and examine accessibility to your stuff, and so forth. But I want to summarize by saying an inclusive approach is knowing your students' profile, is being proactive, is advocating for all your students, it's avoiding being judgmental, is using differentiated instructions, is providing one-to-one support when necessary, is partnershiping with your parents and students, and locate and assess the needed support systems that you have around you. Check with your counselors, and also enhancing learning opportunities within your classroom. I know COVID has done a lot for us, and as COVID has gone through, we see the digital divide, and it's important for us to reflect on it too. But as you go through, remember what I said: no child shall be left behind or should be left behind. Which brings me to somewhat my final thoughts. I talked about inclusivity from the classroom perspective, the external, the internal, and what is necessary, and how would you go about these, and give some strategies. But I want to leave you with another point: organizational inclusivity. As teachers and leaders there, I saw you doing something good today. You recognize those who were mourning, and I appreciate that. And this is a sort of pathway to developing inclusive practices, by recognizing those who are suffering and offering help. But remember, your school environment will only be as inclusive as the management structure. So you might have teachers struggling for inclusivity within the classroom, but if you have a situation where you have a competition for those who will go on this development workshop and so forth, that's anti-inclusive. Inclusion does not work within a competitive framework, but in a framework where everyone is valued. I leave you with these final questions, really. Have you ever been excluded from an event or denied access to a service in Jamaica? Have you ever knowingly used social connections to advance your career? And that's curry favor, who you know, or someone giving you a favor. Have you ever used language to discriminate against anyone in your society, community, or school? Have you ever promoted someone because you personally know them? And the last question you already answered. If you answered yes to all except one, the last one that is, it tells me that we have a work in practice. When I look at that, I still have a lot to do. I still have a lot of work to do. So as I depart at this point in time, I'll forward the slides. I have some more slides that talk about inclusive school, the benefits. It increases staff motivation, enhances productivity, improves recruitment and retention. It shares in the vision and mission of the school. Greater community, teachers working together. And of course, that collaboration can be seen in the classroom. So as we go forward, I've pulled on these frameworks to when I was giving this talk, critical literacy, because that talks about social justice and advocacy, critical pedagogy, anti-racist teaching, social justice, of course. And of course, for us to change, we have to go through the reflection of practice. I want you to look at my work. I've done some work as it relates to creating a blog and a few things. I do post a few things here and there. And I'm on the critical side. If I get up to morning and I think I should do something on that, I do it. And someone said earlier, you are teachers. Do not see the classroom as your only space. See the external element as a place that you can get your voice there, and the voice can be heard. It's because of that voice I'm here presenting to you. And I will welcome opportunities in the future to work with people in Jamaica and colleagues in Jamaica, because inclusion is a work in practice and must be continued consistently and practiced consistently. At this point, I pause and I say to you, thanks for your invite. If you have any questions, I'll take it at this point.